Tonight we explore the life of Abraham Lincoln, the humble rail splitter who became America's 16th president and reshaped a broken nation. From a log cabin in the Kentucky wilderness to the echoes of the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln's story is one of tragedy, triumph, and a relentless pursuit of unity. So before you get comfortable, as always, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you enjoy this kind of calm, reflective storytelling. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes these stories are so engaging, we forget they're meant to help us unwind. Now, it's time to dim the lights, turn on a fan for some quiet background noise, and let's cover what we have for tonight, together. It all began in the quiet hills of Kentucky. On February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin near the small town of Hodgenville, a child was born into poverty. His name was Abraham Lincoln. He would grow up to lead a nation, but that future felt impossibly far away as he took his first breaths on the cold, dirt floor of a frontier home. His family was poor, so poor that even candles were a luxury. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a wandering carpenter and farmer, a stern man who worked with his hands and believed in hard labor. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was gentle, warm, and deeply spiritual. From her, Abraham inherited a sense of quiet reflection that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The Lincolns moved often, chasing land and opportunity, first in Kentucky, then across the Ohio River into Indiana. The land was rough, life was harder. They cleared fields by hand, planted crops, built fences, and tried to survive each winter with just enough to eat. And then, when Abraham was just 9 years old, tragedy struck. His mother fell ill with milk sickness, a deadly disease caused by drinking the milk of cows that had eaten a poisonous plant. She died quickly, and the loss shook the family to its core. For Abraham, it left an invisible wound that never quite healed. He would carry that grief quietly, folding it into the melancholy that shaped his personality. But light returned to the Lincoln home when his father remarried a kind widow named Sarah Bush Johnston. She brought warmth and structure to the family, and she brought books. She saw something in young Abe, something thoughtful and curious. While Thomas Lincoln wanted his son to swing an axe, Sarah encouraged him to open a book. And he did, again and again. The boy from the log cabin had no fancy tutors, no fine clothes, and barely any schooling, but he had a burning hunger to learn. In a world that expected him to plow fields and remain forgotten, Abraham Lincoln quietly began to grow, not in size alone, but in spirit. It was a humble beginning, but even the tallest trees come from the smallest seeds, and Lincoln was just beginning to rise. Abraham Lincoln grew up surrounded by silence, deep forests, long winters, and the slow rhythm of frontier life. But inside that silence, something stirred. While other boys swung axes and hunted game, Abraham was often found beneath a tree, a book open in his lap, lost in a world far from the wilderness. Formal education was almost non-existent in the backwoods of Indiana. In total, Lincoln may have had less than a year of traditional schooling, but he didn't let that stop him. He would borrow any book he could get his hands on, sometimes walking miles just to read a few precious pages. The Bible, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, and later Shakespeare all became his silent teachers. His stepmother Sarah noticed this. She once said that Abraham read all the books he could lay his hands on and would repeat them word for word. She saw something in him that others missed, an almost sacred hunger to understand the world, to make sense of things most boys never even questioned. But life wasn't easy for a boy who read instead of fought. His father, Thomas, didn't fully understand Abraham's obsession with books. He valued hard work, not hard thinking. And while Abraham did his chores, splitting rails, hauling water, tending animals, his mind often wandered elsewhere. He dreamed of distant places, of ancient heroes, of justice, honor, and freedom. People noticed how strange he was. He was tall, awkward, and incredibly strong, yet quiet, almost shy. And when he did speak, his words carried a weight beyond his years. His neighbors were baffled by this lanky teen who could quote entire passages of poetry, then out-wrestle the strongest man in the county, but underneath his calm voice and polite manner was a restless energy. Lincoln wasn't satisfied with the life he'd been born into. The log cabin had taught him how to survive, but the books taught him how to think, and more importantly, how to dream. He once wrote, "The things I want to know are in books. My best friend is the man who'll get me a book I ain't read." It was in those pages, lit by candlelight, that Abraham Lincoln first began shaping the mind and the heart that would one day guide a nation through its darkest storm. By the time Abraham Lincoln reached his early 20s, he was tall, remarkably tall, standing at 6 feet 4 inches. He wore clothes that rarely fit, his pants always a little too short, his sleeves a little too loose. His face was lean and weathered, and his voice carried a slow, thoughtful rhythm. He looked like a man carved from the very trees he once split. In 1831, Lincoln arrived in the small frontier town of New Salem, Illinois. He had no money, no formal training, and no clear plan. But he had something more powerful than a resume. People liked him. Almost instantly. He took a job as a store clerk, and though the store wasn't always busy, Abe made an impression. He was known for being honest to a fault. If someone overpaid by a few cents, he would walk miles just to return the change. If he borrowed a book or tool, he always brought it back, sometimes in better condition than when he received it. His honesty earned him a nickname, Honest Abe. But it wasn't just his integrity that won people over, it was his wit. He told stories, long, meandering, hilarious stories. Stories that made people forget their troubles and lean in a little closer. He had a gift for language and timing, a way of turning even a simple anecdote into something unforgettable. He wasn't polished, he wasn't educated. But in New Salem, Lincoln began building something important: trust. People came to him for advice, for laughter, and eventually for leadership. In 1832, he ran for the state legislature. He lost, but he didn't disappear. 2 years later, he tried again, and this time he won. In between, he served briefly in the Black Hawk War, not as a fighter, but as a captain. He never saw combat, but he was elected by the men, another sign that people believed in him. Lincoln's time in New Salem was short, but it was foundational. It was there that he tasted the beginnings of public life. There, that quiet boy who read by firelight became a man people listened to. He wasn't just telling stories anymore. He was beginning to write one of his own. After his time in New Salem, Abraham Lincoln set his sights on something bigger: the law. He had no formal degree, no classroom, no teacher. Instead, he studied alone, borrowing law books and reading them late into the night, just as he had done with poetry and scripture in his boyhood. By 1836, he passed the Illinois bar exam and became a licensed attorney. Springfield, Illinois became his new home, a growing town full of energy, politics, and ambition. There, Lincoln joined a law firm and began taking on all kinds of cases: property disputes, debts, assaults, even murder trials. He quickly earned a reputation as a skilled, fair, and ethical lawyer. He spoke plainly in court, used humor when needed, and never humiliated his opponents, even when he outsmarted them. But Springfield didn't just shape Lincoln's career, it also changed his heart. It was there that he met Mary Todd, a well-educated woman from a wealthy Kentucky family. Mary was unlike anyone Lincoln had ever known. She was sharp, confident, and shared his interest in politics. Their courtship was complicated. They were engaged, then separated, then reconciled again. Some of Lincoln's friends said he wasn't sure if he was good enough for her. Others believed he feared he couldn't give her the life she deserved. Still, on November 4th, 1842, they married. Their union was passionate and stormy. Mary had a fiery temper and suffered from emotional instability. Lincoln, calm but often distant, struggled with melancholy. They loved each other deeply, but lived through many difficult seasons together. They had 4 sons: Robert, Edward, William, and Thomas, though heartbreak would touch the family again. Edward died at just 4 years old. Willie, perhaps Lincoln's favorite, died of illness in the White House at age 11. Only Robert would live into adulthood. Behind the courtroom victories and rising public career, Lincoln carried a deep private sorrow. He was often quiet, spending long hours alone. Friends described his sadness as something that never left him, like a shadow following just behind. But through it all, he kept going. He had begun to see that the law was more than just rules and arguments. It was about people, about fairness, about right and wrong. And somewhere deep inside, Lincoln was already imagining a country that could be more just than the one he had inherited. By the mid-1850s, America was cracking under the weight of its own contradictions. It called itself the land of liberty, yet millions were still enslaved. The debate over slavery was no longer just a matter of politics. It was becoming a national identity crisis. And Abraham Lincoln, once a one-term congressman, found himself drawn back into the storm. At first, Lincoln hadn't spoken out forcefully. He disliked slavery, calling it morally wrong, but he didn't see himself as a radical. What he did believe, with clarity and conviction, was that slavery must not expand. That's what brought him back into the public eye. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. To Lincoln, this wasn't just bad policy. It was a betrayal of the founding ideals. He began speaking again, slowly at first, then with increasing power and purpose. And then came 1858, the year of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Stephen A. Douglas was a seasoned senator, charismatic and confident. Lincoln, the challenger, looked plain by comparison. But when they met in 7 open-air debates across Illinois, Lincoln surprised everyone. He didn't shout, he didn't insult. He reasoned, calmly, persistently, forcefully. He asked, "Can a nation remain half slave and half free?" And he didn't believe it could. Though Lincoln lost the Senate race, his words traveled far beyond Illinois. Newspapers across the country published his arguments. People started talking about this tall, awkward lawyer from the Midwest who spoke with honesty and moral clarity. By 1860, he was being considered for the highest office in the land. The Republican Party saw in Lincoln something rare, a man who opposed slavery without hatred, who spoke firmly but not cruelly. He wasn't the favorite, but in a divided field, he emerged as the nominee. And then, on a cold November night in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. The South didn't wait for him to take office. Within weeks, states began to secede. The Union, the very idea of the United States, was crumbling. Lincoln hadn't yet stepped into the White House, but already he was walking into history. When Abraham Lincoln took office in March of 1861, he stepped into a nation already at the edge of collapse. 7 southern states had seceded before he even placed his hand on the Bible. More would follow. They believed his presidency threatened their way of life, especially the institution of slavery. Lincoln didn't want war, he wanted unity. But when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April, the choice was made for him. The Civil War had begun. He had never led an army, never commanded troops, never studied war. Yet now the fate of a nation rested on his shoulders. He read military books at night, consulted generals by day, and made difficult decisions, often alone and often with heavy doubts. The war dragged on, and it was brutal. Battle after battle, the death toll rose. Young boys, both North and South, marched into muddy fields and never returned. Cities were burned. Families were torn apart. Brothers fought brothers. It was no longer a political disagreement. It was a human tragedy. Lincoln faced pressure from all sides. Newspapers mocked him. Political enemies accused him of tyranny. Even members of his own cabinet questioned his leadership. He fired general after general, searching for someone who could match the urgency of the hour. And at home, he grieved. In 1862, his beloved son Willie died from typhoid fever inside the White House. Lincoln, already prone to sadness, was devastated. He shut himself away, sometimes visiting Willie's grave late at night. But still, he carried on. In the middle of this chaos, he made one of the boldest moves in American history. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were now free. It didn't end slavery overnight, but it changed the war. It turned the fight into a moral battle, not just to save the Union, but to redefine it. Lincoln once said, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." And with that document, he put the full weight of the presidency behind that belief. He didn't just want to win a war, he wanted to win the soul of a country. As the war raged on, Abraham Lincoln understood something deeply. That battles might decide the outcome of a war, but words could shape the soul of a nation. He had always been a man of careful speech, choosing each phrase with patience. But in 1863, standing on a battlefield soaked with blood, he would give a speech that would live forever. The Battle of Gettysburg had been one of the deadliest of the war. Over 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. The town was left scarred, the fields turned into graveyards. In November, months after the battle ended, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a national cemetery. He wasn't the main speaker. That role belonged to a well-known orator who spoke for over 2 hours. Then Lincoln stood up. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat and began to speak. His voice was quiet, and the speech lasted barely 2 minutes. Just 272 words. No grand gestures, no dramatic flourishes. Just clarity, purpose, and poetry. 77 years ago, he began, reaching back to the founding of the nation. He reminded the crowd and the country that this war was not only about preserving the Union, it was about proving that a government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. It was a promise, a reminder, a challenge. At first, many were silent. Some didn't know what to make of such a short speech, but over time, those words became something more. They were repeated in classrooms, engraved on monuments, and memorized by generations. In a time of chaos, Lincoln offered simplicity. In a time of hatred, he offered dignity. He didn't speak to crush his enemies. He spoke to lift the living, to give meaning to the fallen. The Gettysburg Address wasn't just a speech. It was a turning point, not of the war, but of national identity. Lincoln redefined what it meant to be American, not just united by borders, but united by ideals. He believed words could heal, and with 272 of them, he helped a grieving nation begin to remember what it stood for. By the beginning of 1865, the end of the war was finally in sight. After 4 long, bloody years, the Union armies were closing in on the Confederacy. Cities had fallen, supply lines were collapsing, and with every passing week, the South's resistance began to crumble. But Abraham Lincoln didn't celebrate. He was tired, not just in body, but in soul. The war had aged him. His face was lined, his eyes heavier, his once dark hair now almost entirely gray. Friends and reporters noted how thin he'd become. The burdens of war, death, and national division had carved their weight into his frame. And yet his focus never shifted. Even as victory approached, he thought not about punishment, but about healing. In his second inaugural address, delivered in March 1865, Lincoln spoke not with triumph, but with grace. He didn't gloat. Instead, he offered words of reconciliation. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he said, urging the nation to bind up its wounds and care for those who had suffered on both sides. It was one of his most beautiful speeches, calm, humble, and deeply human. Then, on April 9th, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. The Union had been saved. And slavery, the institution that had divided the country for centuries, was finally ending. Across the North, bells rang and crowds cheered. There was a sense of relief, of cautious hope. People imagined a future of rebuilding, of reunion. Lincoln began making plans, not just to restore the South, but to reimagine what America could become. He would never get the chance. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, on the evening of April 14, 1865, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. As he sat in his theater box, A well-known actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth slipped in and shot him in the back of the head. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He died the next morning. April 15th, with his wife Mary by his side and the nation in mourning. He had lived to see the war end, but not the peace that followed. When Abraham Lincoln died, the country didn't just lose a president, it lost its compass. News of his death spread like a cold wind across the nation. In the north, people wept openly in the streets. Church bells rang for hours. Businesses closed. Entire cities went silent. Even those who had once criticized him now spoke of his greatness with reverence. His body was placed in a grand funeral train that journeyed from Washington, D.C., all the way back to his home in Springfield, Illinois. Along the route, thousands lined the tracks, standing in silence as the train passed. Men removed their hats. Women held their children close. It wasn't just mourning. It was a farewell to the man who had held them together during the country's darkest hour. Lincoln was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery, near the town where he had once walked as a young lawyer. The grave would soon be marked by a towering monument, and later still, his face would be etched in stone at Mount Rushmore and printed on currency. But behind all the marble and myths was a man, a real man, one who battled depression, one who knew grief intimately, one who never believed himself to be extraordinary. And yet, he changed everything. Lincoln didn't live to see the full impact of his work. He never saw the Reconstruction struggles or the long civil rights movement that would come more than a century later. But the seeds he planted, in speeches, in laws, in moral clarity, continued to grow. He reminded America what it should strive to be, not perfect, but better, not divided, but united, not driven by hate or fear, but by compassion, reason, and courage. Today, we remember Lincoln as the great emancipator, the savior of the Union, the man who led with both strength and gentleness. But perhaps what makes him truly great is not just what he did, it's who he was. A boy who read by candlelight, a lawyer who spoke with honesty, a leader who never lost sight of humanity. His life reminds us that greatness doesn't require perfection, only purpose, integrity, and a heart that refuses to turn away from what is right. And in that way, Abraham Lincoln still lives, in the ideals he helped shape, and in the quiet strength he left behind. To many, the word Viking conjures images of wild warriors with axes and horned helmets, storming villages and burning everything in sight. But the truth, as it often is with history, is more complicated and far more interesting. The Vikings weren't a single people or empire. They were Norsemen, seafaring tribes from modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, living between the late 8th and early 11th centuries. To themselves, they weren't even Vikings. The term Viking was more a verb than a name. To go Viking meant to go on an expedition, sometimes to trade, sometimes to raid. They were farmers, fishermen, blacksmiths, storytellers. They raised goats and wheat. They built wooden halls. They worshipped gods like Odin and Thor, and believed that their fate was woven by unseen hands, the Norns, who watched over every soul. Most Viking men weren't warriors. They were workers, strong, skilled, and deeply connected to the land. But when the harvests failed, when the fjords froze, when opportunity called across the sea, many took up their shields and swords. They weren't driven by bloodlust. They were driven by survival and ambition. Their world was one of harsh winters, short summers, and a constant struggle against nature. But they were adaptable, fiercely so, and their curiosity was endless. They sailed across waters others feared. They explored unknown lands. They mingled with cultures far beyond their own. Some became merchants, sailing down the rivers of Eastern Europe to trade in silk and spices with the Byzantines. Others founded settlements in places as far as Ireland, France, and even Russia. To those they attacked, they were seen as barbarians, destroyers of peace, but to themselves they were bold adventurers, carving out a future in a world that often gave them little. It's easy to paint them with one brush, to imagine them as only raiders, but their true story is more layered, more human. Before we follow them across seas, into battles and legends, we must first remember the Vikings were not monsters. They were men, and they were about to change the world. If the Vikings had one unmatched advantage, it was their ships. Long, narrow, and elegant in design, the Viking longship was not just a mode of transport. It was a symbol of freedom, fear, and possibility. Carved from oak and assembled with precision, these vessels were both strong and flexible. The wood planks overlapped like fish scales, held together with iron rivets and sealed with animal hair and tar to keep out the cold, salty sea. Their design allowed the hulls to flex with the waves instead of fighting them, giving the longships incredible stability in rough water. Each one was a marvel of engineering. The average longship could carry 40 to 60 warriors, along with supplies, tools, and weapons. But what made them so feared and so effective wasn't just their size or speed, it was their adaptability. Viking ships could travel across the open ocean and then glide silently up narrow rivers. They could sail in just a meter of water, meaning they could strike deep inland where no one expected them, and they didn't need harbors or docks to land, just a stretch of beach, a shallow bank, or even a rocky shore. In the time it took villagers to spot them, the Vikings were already ashore. At the front of many ships was a carved figurehead, often a dragon or serpent, designed to frighten both enemies and evil spirits. As the ships approached, the sea seemed to churn beneath their prows, their sails full of wind, their crews silent but ready. The sight of a longship on the horizon became the stuff of nightmares across Europe. It meant trouble was coming, fast, unexpected, and ruthless. But not all longships were used for war. Some were merchant vessels, wider and deeper to carry goods. Others were for exploration, sailing west to Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. The longship was more than a machine. It was freedom, a way to escape poverty, seek glory, or find a new home. With their ships, the Vikings weren't bound by borders. The ocean was their road, and every horizon was an invitation. The world first truly noticed the Vikings on a quiet summer day in the year 793. It began on the holy island of Lindisfarne, just off the northeastern coast of England. For years, monks had lived there in peace, copying manuscripts, praying, tending their flocks. It was a sacred place, a place of silence, learning, and devotion. Then came the ships, long, slender, and unfamiliar. They sliced through the sea with terrifying grace. No warning, no negotiations, no chance to prepare. The Vikings came ashore swiftly. Their axes flashed, their shields clashed, and in moments the monastery, once a place of sanctuary, became a scene of chaos. The monks were unarmed. They had no soldiers, no walls, no idea what was coming. Some were killed, others taken as slaves. The church was plundered. Gold, silver, and holy relics were carried away. It was not just a robbery, it was a shock. The people of Christian Europe believed their holy sites were protected by divine power. But here were these strange men from the north, gods of thunder on their lips, not Christ. News of the raid spread quickly. It was written in fear and disbelief. The wrath of the Northmen, one chronicler wrote, is upon us. To the English, the Vikings seemed like demons, merciless, bloodthirsty, and godless. But to the Vikings, it was something else entirely. They saw wealth, unguarded and plentiful, and they took it. Lindisfarne was only the beginning. Over the next few decades, Viking raids became more frequent, not just in England, but across Ireland, Scotland, and the coasts of France. They struck monasteries, ports, and villages always quickly, often before anyone could react. They didn't come to destroy for destruction's sake. They came for silver, spices, livestock, and slaves, to survive, to gain. And yes, sometimes, to prove their courage. To a Viking warrior, a successful raid meant honor, a share of treasure, a name that would be sung around firelit halls. But these early raids sparked something bigger. They changed how the world saw the North, and they marked the beginning of an age when no coast was ever truly safe again. Though history often remembers Vikings as brutal raiders, that's only one part of the story. Not long after the first waves of raids swept across the coasts of Europe, something curious happened. The Vikings didn't always leave. They stayed, they built, they became settlers. In Ireland, towns like Dublin and Wexford began as Viking outposts. Simple camps where raiders could rest, repair their ships, and prepare for the next strike. But over time, these camps grew. Markets appeared. Homes were built. Families formed. The raiders had become residents. It happened again and again. In northern England, the Vikings carved out a territory called the Danelaw, land under Norse control, where Viking law was enforced instead of English rule. In Scotland, the Orkney and Shetland Islands became Norse strongholds. Even in modern-day Russia, Vikings, known there as the Rus, navigated the rivers and began ruling over Slavic towns, founding trade centers that would one day become cities like Kiev. But one of the most important shifts happened in France. In 911, a Viking leader named Rollo struck a deal with the Frankish king Charles the Simple. Rollo had been raiding northern France for years, his fleet attacking along the river Seine. But instead of continuing the endless violence, Charles offered land in exchange for peace. Rollo accepted, and the region became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. There, Norse culture slowly blended with Frankish tradition. Vikings became Christian. They adopted local customs, language, and farming techniques. Within a few generations, their descendants would be fully French, and yet still carry the legacy of their Viking roots. This pattern repeated across the Viking world. The same hands that once swung axes began tilling fields. The same ships that carried warriors now transported grain, cloth, and tools. The sword gave way to the plow. Viking settlers intermarried with local populations. They learned new languages. They brought their gods, and sometimes left them behind. They didn't just invade, they transformed. The image of the wild, lawless Viking hides a deeper truth. They weren't just destroyers of kingdoms, they were founders of them. To understand the Vikings, you must understand what they believed. Because behind every raid, every voyage, every final breath on the battlefield was a belief in something greater, something eternal. The Norse world was filled with gods, giants, spirits, and fate. They believed that life was not random, but woven, literally, by three mysterious beings known as the Norns. These sisters sat at the base of the world tree, Yggdrasil, and spun the destinies of every man and woman. At the center of this mythic universe was Odin, the Allfather. A one-eyed god of wisdom, war, and poetry, Odin had traded one of his eyes for knowledge. He was always seeking, just like the Vikings themselves. Then there was Thor, the thunder god wielding his mighty hammer Mjolnir. He protected gods and humans alike from the forces of chaos, riding into battle with lightning in his wake. Many Vikings wore Thor's hammer as an amulet, a symbol of strength and courage. Freya, the goddess of love, beauty, and war, also played a central role. It was said that she claimed half the souls of fallen warriors, taking them to her hall, while the other half went to Odin's great hall, Valhalla. Ah, Valhalla. To the Vikings, death was not something to fear. If a man died bravely in battle, he would be carried by Valkyries, warrior maidens of Odin, to the golden halls of Valhalla, where he would feast, fight, and celebrate until the end of days. But if a warrior died of sickness, cowardice, or old age, he would not go to Valhalla. He would fade into a quieter, lesser afterlife. To die without honor was the greatest tragedy. This belief shaped how Vikings lived. They welcomed risk. They faced battle with courage, not because they didn't fear death, but because they hoped to earn a place in the next world. Their myths weren't just stories, they were instructions, guides for how to live with pride, face hardship, and meet death without flinching. For the Norse, the gods were not distant, they were present, watching, waiting. And when a Viking lifted his sword and charged into danger, he wasn't alone. It's one of the most iconic images in popular culture. A Viking warrior, towering and wild, with a snarling beard and a helmet adorned with massive, curved horns. It looks fierce. It looks bold. But it's not true. The idea that Vikings wore horned helmets is a myth, one born not from archaeology, but from art and theatre, centuries after the Viking Age had ended. No Viking helmet with horns has ever been found. None appear in carvings, tapestries, or descriptions from the time. The helmets that have been discovered, like the famous one found in Geirmundur, Norway, are simple, practical, and made of iron, rounded, reinforced, and close-fitting, built for function, not intimidation. So where did the horned image come from? It began in the 1800s, during the Romantic era, when artists and composers became fascinated by ancient myths and warrior cultures. When Richard Wagner composed his famous operas about Norse gods and heroes, costume designers needed a look that matched the drama. They added horns. These theatrical helmets looked powerful on stage. They gave singers a larger-than-life presence. Audiences were thrilled, and from there the image stuck. Books, paintings, and later Hollywood films embraced it. Horned helmets became a symbol of wild strength, a shortcut for Viking. But real Viking warriors would have found such helmets ridiculous. Horns on a battlefield would have made them easy targets. The horns could catch weapons, get stuck indoors, or throw off balance during a fight. Vikings were practical people. Their gear was designed for survival, not style. That doesn't mean they weren't artistic. Their weapons and armor were often beautifully carved with knotwork and animals. Their ships bore dragon heads. Their jewelry had deep meaning. But when it came to battle, efficiency mattered most. Even so, the myth lives on. In cartoons, in costumes, in football team logos. It's hard to shake such a bold image, even when history tells a different story. But the truth is more interesting than the fiction. Because the real Vikings didn't need horns to be terrifying. They had skill, they had strategy, and they had a silence before the storm that no helmet could capture. The Vikings were not just raiders or settlers. They were explorers, restless, curious, and unafraid of the unknown. While much of Europe viewed the sea as a boundary, the Norse saw it as a road, a challenge, yes, but never a wall. Driven by overpopulation, limited farmland, and the promise of riches, Viking explorers pushed beyond the known edges of the map. Their longships, fast, light, and maneuverable, made it possible to go where no one else dared. First, they sailed west to the British Isles, then farther to the wild coast of Ireland and the rocky shores of Scotland. Soon, they discovered the windswept Faroe Islands, and then a great mist-covered land, Iceland. In the late 9th century, Norse families began settling in Iceland. There they built farms, established a parliament, and wrote sagas, stories of gods, ghosts, and heroic voyages. But even Iceland wasn't far enough. By the late 10th century, Eric the Red, a bold and exiled chieftain, set sail from Iceland and reached a vast icy coastline. He named it Greenland, hoping the name would attract settlers. It worked, but the most legendary voyage came next. Around the year 1000, Eric's son, Leif Erikson, set sail even farther west. He landed on a new land, one with forests, grasslands, and grapes. The Norse called it Vinland. Most scholars believe Vinland was part of modern-day Newfoundland in Canada. Leif and his crew built a small settlement, now known as L'Anse aux Meadows, the first known European presence in North America. This happened nearly 500 years before Columbus would sail from Spain. But the Norse presence in Vinland didn't last. Conflict with indigenous peoples, harsh winters, and the distance from home eventually forced them to abandon the settlement. Still, they had come. They had crossed the Atlantic and returned. Their journeys were not just about conquest, they were about possibility. Vikings explored the rivers of Eastern Europe, traded with the Byzantine Empire, and journeyed through deserts and forests in search of something more. They didn't always know where they were going, but they went anyway. In a world bounded by fear, the Norse spirit moved with the tide, ever outward, always wondering, What lies beyond? No age lasts forever, not even one born on wind and sea. By the middle of the 11th century, the Viking world was changing, slowly at first, then all at once. The raids that once shook the coasts of Europe began to fade. The longships still sailed, but they carried more goods than warriors. The same hands that once gripped axes were now signing treaties, trading furs, and kneeling in prayer. One by one, the old pagan beliefs gave way to Christianity. Missionaries had arrived decades earlier, some as captives, others as guests. And over time, their influence grew. Kings and chieftains began converting, not only for spiritual reasons, but for alliances, legitimacy, and peace with Christian neighbors. With religion came structure, and with structure came kingdoms. In Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, strong central monarchies began to take shape. Local chiefs were replaced by royal law. Raiding gave way to taxes. The wild independence that had once defined Viking society was being reshaped by order. At the same time, European defenses improved. Castles rose along the coastlines. Towns fortified their walls. The element of surprise, so crucial to Viking raids, was vanishing. The world was simply growing harder for Vikings to thrive in. One of the final chapters came in 1066. A powerful Norse king named Harald Hardrada sailed to England with dreams of reclaiming a throne. He fought bravely at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, but was killed in battle. Just weeks later, another invasion came, this time from William, Duke of Normandy, himself a descendant of Vikings. He conquered England, not as a raider, but as a king. The Viking Age had come full circle, from seaborne raiders to crowned rulers, from oral myths to written laws. And then the sails faded from the horizon. But while the raids ended, the legacy remained. In place names, in languages, in bloodlines, in the fierce independence of Iceland, in the stones carved with runes that still whisper their stories. The age of the Viking had passed, but their spirit, bold, curious, and unrelenting, had already changed the world. And some part of that spirit still sails quietly beneath the surface of our history. The sails are gone, the oars have stopped. The longships rest in museums and burial mounds. But the legacy of the Vikings still moves quietly through the world. They left no empire in the traditional sense, no towering ruins or marble temples, and yet their impact is carved deeply into the bones of modern Europe and beyond. In England, over 1,000 towns and villages bear Norse names. Words like knife, sky, window, and berserk come straight from the Old Norse tongue. Even the days of the week, Tuesday for Tyr, Wednesday for Odin, Thursday for Thor, and Friday for Freya, remind us that the gods of the Vikings still echo in the calendars we live by. In Ireland, cities like Dublin were founded by Norse settlers, first as ports for plunder, then as trading hubs, and finally as thriving medieval communities. In France, the Normans, descendants of Viking settlers, would go on to shape the history of Europe through war and rule, most famously in 1066, when William the Conqueror claimed the English crown. In Iceland, their language survives almost untouched, so close to Old Norse that ancient sagas can still be read aloud with little translation. These sagas, written on parchment in flickering candlelight, preserve the myths, values, and dreams of a people long gone, yet never fully forgotten. But their legacy isn't just historical, it's cultural, it's emotional. The Viking spirit of daring, endurance, and curiosity has become a symbol around the world. Books, films, games, and television shows continue to reimagine their stories, often more myth than truth. And yet something remains authentic in their portrayal, the sense of wild freedom, of facing storms head-on, of crossing boundaries others fear. We remember the Vikings not only for their ferocity, but for their humanity, for being people who lived fully in a world that demanded strength and sacrifice. They were poets and explorers, raiders and rulers, mothers and fathers, storytellers and seekers. The Viking Age may be over, but its waves are still washing upon the shores of our culture, gently reminding us that the sea was never the end of their world. It was only ever the beginning. Long before the first Spanish sails appeared on the horizon, there stood a city that seemed to defy nature itself. Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, rose from the waters of Lake Texcoco like a dream. A place of stone and symmetry, built on islands and connected by great causeways, it was unlike anything the Europeans had ever imagined. Founded in 1325, according to legend, the Aztecs were guided there by a prophecy to find an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. That vision appeared on a swampy lake bed, and there they built their empire, stone by stone, canal by canal. By the early 1500s, Tenochtitlan had become one of the largest cities in the world, with over 200,000 inhabitants. Its avenues were wide and clean. Its canals bustled with canoes. The city shimmered with white buildings, vibrant marketplaces, and towering temples. At the heart of it all stood the Templo Mayor, a massive double pyramid that reached toward the sky. One side was dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, the other to Tlaloc, the god of rain and fertility. Offerings, prayers, and, at times, blood were given to keep the balance between earth and sky. Life in the empire was highly structured. Nobles, priests, warriors, merchants, and farmers all had their roles. Children learned to read pictographs. Tribute flowed in from neighboring regions. Cacao, feathers, obsidian, jade, maize, and more. The empire thrived through war, trade, and religion, and through it all, one man stood at the pinnacle, Montezuma II, emperor, ruler, and divine representative of the gods on earth. Wise, cautious, and deeply spiritual, he lived surrounded by advisors and omens. He ruled not just a city, but a complex, sophisticated civilization stretching across central Mexico. But the Aztecs did not rule peacefully. Many of their neighbors resented their power, their tribute demands, and their human sacrifices. Beneath the surface of wealth and ritual, old wounds and tensions simmered, and far beyond the mountains and lakes, across an ocean the Aztecs did not know existed, ships had set sail. They carried foreign weapons, foreign beliefs, and a hunger for gold and glory. Tenochtitlan stood tall, proud, and unshaken. But the clouds were beginning to gather. In 1519, a fleet of 11 ships touched the shore of the Yucatan Peninsula. From them stepped Hernán Cortés, a Spanish conquistador with no royal title, no great army, and no permission to conquer an empire. But what he lacked in authority, he made up for with cunning, ambition, and a dangerous kind of charisma. Cortés brought just over 500 soldiers, a few cannon, 16 horses, and a deep belief that God and gold were on his side. What he encountered in the New World, however, was something far greater than he expected. As the Spaniards moved inland, they met fierce resistance from native peoples, but also allies. Many indigenous groups resented Aztec domination. They had paid tribute for years, seen their sons taken as sacrifices, and longed for freedom. Cortés saw opportunity. He fought, yes, but more often he negotiated, and in these early days he gained something far more valuable than weapons or gold. He gained Malintzin, also known as La Malinche, a native woman gifted in language and intelligence. She became his translator, cultural guide, and eventually his closest confidant. Through her, Cortés could speak to the people. Through her, he could manipulate fear, forge alliances, and untangle the threads of a world he did not understand. As the Spaniards journeyed westward, stories reached them of a mighty empire in the mountains, of cities made of gold, of great temples, and of a king who ruled with divine power. To the Spaniards, these tales only fueled their desire. To the people they met along the way, Cortés promised an end to Aztec tyranny. He burned his ships to prevent retreat. He marched with growing forces, now joined by thousands of indigenous allies. And slowly, step by step, he drew closer to the heart of the empire. In Tenochtitlan, Montezuma received word of these strange men, pale-skinned, bearded, dressed in metal, riding beasts no one had seen before. Some believed they were gods, others saw a darker omen. And as Cortés climbed the mountain roads, flanked by allies and armed with fire, both the emperor and the conquistador prepared for a meeting that would change history. One ruled an empire, the other came to end it. On November 8, 1519, two men stood face to face for the first time. Hernán Cortés, the Spanish conquistador, armored, determined, flanked by foreign weapons and native allies. And Montezuma too, the divine emperor of the Aztecs, draped in feathers and gold, ruler of a city that sparkled like a jewel in the lake. It was not just a meeting of men, it was a collision of worlds. As Cortés and his soldiers entered Tenochtitlan, they were stunned. The city stretched for miles, its white temples rising above turquoise canals and busy marketplaces. It was cleaner, larger, and more sophisticated than any city they had seen in Europe. Some Spaniards whispered that they had walked into a dream. Montezuma welcomed them not with spears but with ceremony. He presented gifts of gold, food, and precious cloaks. He offered words of peace and housed Cortés in a royal palace. According to Spanish records, he may have even bowed, though what that gesture meant to Montezuma and how it was interpreted by the Spanish may never be fully known. For Montezuma, this was a delicate moment. The omens had been troubling. Lightning striking temples, mysterious visions in the sky, and rumors of strange men arriving from the east. His priests feared the return of Quetzalcoatl, a god who, according to legend, would return from the sea. Montezuma was a thoughtful ruler, but also cautious. He may have believed diplomacy was the only way to avoid bloodshed, or perhaps he hoped to learn more before taking action. Whatever his reasoning, he chose to receive Cortés as an honored guest rather than an invader. But to Cortés, the reception was a sign of weakness. He saw riches, not rituals, an empire ripe for the taking, not a sovereign city showing hospitality. The two men could speak to each other only through layers of translation, from Nahuatl to Mayan to Spanish. Words were chosen carefully, but meaning often slipped through the cracks. Respect was mistaken for submission, ritual mistaken for fear. The Spanish believed they had gained control. The Aztecs believed they were maintaining balance. In that moment of false understanding, the seeds of disaster were quietly sown, and in the shadow of great temples, the slow unraveling of a civilization had already begun. At first, the Spaniards were honored guests in Tenochtitlan, housed in a grand palace, fed with the empire's finest foods, and permitted to move through the city freely. Cortés walked its avenues, studied its temples, and observed its people. He was fascinated, but never fooled. Behind his admiration was calculation. Cortés knew he was surrounded. His army, though growing, was still vastly outnumbered. The Aztecs were proud, organized, and militarily powerful. If Montezuma gave the order, the Spaniards could be wiped out in a single night. So Cortés acted first, not with force, but with strategy. He placed Montezuma under house arrest. It wasn't a dramatic seizure. The emperor remained in his palace, still dressed in gold, still treated with honor. But guards now stood at every entrance. The man who had ruled an empire could no longer walk his own city freely. To the Spanish, this was a brilliant move. By controlling Montezuma, they believed they controlled the empire. And for a time, that illusion seemed real. The emperor remained passive, some say resigned. Others believe he hoped to avoid a full-scale war. Perhaps he still believed the Spaniards could be persuaded to leave. Or perhaps he had begun to lose faith, not only in diplomacy, but in the gods themselves. While imprisoned, Montezuma continued to speak to his people from the palace roof. He assured them that the Spaniards meant no harm. He pleaded for calm, but calm was crumbling. The Aztecs grew restless. Whispers turned to anger. The streets, once filled with trade and song, were now thick with tension. Many no longer saw Montezuma as a leader. He had allowed foreign invaders into their sacred city. He had not fought. He had bowed too far. Cortés, too, began to sense the shift. His alliance with the emperor was built on uncertain ground, and beneath him the foundation of Aztec rule was beginning to crack. Still, no blood had yet been spilled inside the heart of the city. There was still a chance, slim, fragile, to avoid catastrophe. But the line between diplomacy and domination had already blurred, and soon a single act of violence would erase it completely. While Hernán Cortés was away from Tenochtitlan, having marched to the coast to confront a Spanish rival sent to arrest him, he left his second-in-command, Pedro de Alvarado, in charge of the city. Alvarado was not Cortés. Where Cortés used diplomacy and restraint, Alvarado ruled with suspicion and fear. During Cortés' absence, the Aztecs prepared to celebrate one of their most sacred festivals, Toxcatl, a ritual honoring the god Tezcatlipoca, lord of the night and fate. It was a time of music, dancing, and ceremony held within the courtyard of the Templo Mayor. Nobles, priests, and warriors gathered in full regalia, adorned with feathers and gold. But to Alvarado, it looked like rebellion. He claimed to have heard rumors of an uprising, though no attack had come. Paranoia clouded his judgment. He feared the Aztecs were preparing to strike, and so he struck first. As the dancers performed and drums echoed into the sky, Spanish soldiers stormed the courtyard. They blocked the exits. Then, without warning, they began to kill. They cut down unarmed men, priests, and nobles alike, slashing through the crowd with swords and spears. The blood of the city's most honored citizens soaked the temple stones. Those who tried to flee were cut down. Those who resisted were slaughtered. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. The music stopped. The city fell silent. And then the silence turned to fury. When Cortés returned days later, he found a city transformed. The people, once cautious, were now enraged. The illusion of peace was gone. The Aztecs surrounded the Spanish quarters, blocking the causeways, cutting off supplies. Tenochtitlan had become a trap, a boiling cage of stone and lake water. Inside, Montezuma, still a prisoner, could no longer calm his people. Many no longer listened. Some no longer even believed he ruled. The empire had entered a moment without balance, without direction. Rage filled the void. Cortés tried to salvage what he could. He spoke to Montezuma. He offered gifts. He pleaded for calm. But what had been spilled in the temple could not be swept away. The gods had been insulted. The ancestors shamed. The sacred blood of a civilization had been spilled, and it would demand an answer. Trapped inside a city that once welcomed them, the Spaniards now lived behind barricades. Their food dwindled. Their allies died. Their hopes narrowed to a single thought: escape. Cortés tried diplomacy one last time. He brought Montezuma to the palace rooftop, hoping the emperor could calm the crowds. But the people no longer listened. Some hurled stones. One struck Montezuma in the head. Days later, he died, in silence, under Spanish watch. His death marked the final break. The last symbol of peace had fallen. On the night of June 30th, 1520, Cortés made his move. Under a moonless sky, rain pouring from the heavens, the Spaniards and their native allies began slipping out of the city, carrying with them what they could: weapons, supplies, and gold. Too much gold. Greed slowed them. Armor weighed them down. The causeways, narrow bridges over the lake, became bottlenecks. The Aztecs were waiting. From canoes and rooftops, warriors launched their attack. Arrows rained down, spears pierced the dark. Some Spaniards slipped on the wet stone and fell into the lake, dragged down by their treasures. Others were captured alive. Their fate sealed atop the same pyramids they once marveled at. Cortés fought to keep order, but chaos ruled. Bodies filled the water. Screams cut through the rain. In the darkness, no one knew who lived or died. By dawn, the survivors reached the far shore, bloodied, broken, and hollow-eyed. Cortés sat beneath a tree and wept. This night would be remembered as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. Hundreds of Spaniards were dead. Thousands of native allies had perished. The dream of conquest seemed shattered, but it was not the end. Cortés regrouped. The survivors limped toward Tlaxcala, where they rested and rebuilt. More allies joined him, drawn by the shared hatred of the Aztec Empire. Though battered, the Spanish still held their guns, their steel, and their deadly resolve. But something else had already entered Tenochtitlan, invisible, silent, and far more lethal. While swords clashed and causeways ran red, a single infected man had left behind a legacy far more devastating than gold or fire. Smallpox had arrived, and it would finish what weapons could not. While the Spanish mourned their losses and rebuilt their strength, an invisible invader was already at work inside the heart of the Aztec Empire. Smallpox. It arrived quietly, clinging to the breath and skin of a single infected man, a black slave who had traveled with the Spanish forces. No one noticed at first. A cough, a fever, a rash. But then it spread. Tenochtitlan, once a city of color, sound, and life, began to fall silent. Entire families were wiped out in days. Children, priests, warriors, all struck down without warning. The dead filled homes and temples. The living, too weak to bury them, began to abandon hope. The Aztecs had never seen such a sickness. Their healers were powerless. Their gods offered no relief. Panic set in, followed by despair. As many as half the city's population perished, not from battle, but from disease. Among the dead was Cuitlahuac, Montezuma's brother and successor. His reign had lasted only 80 days. The empire, leaderless and reeling, chose a new ruler, Cuauhtémoc, a young noble with fire in his spirit and defiance in his heart. Meanwhile, Cortés returned, stronger than before. He now commanded over 100,000 native allies, including the fierce Tlaxcalans. To many tribes, the Aztecs had been cruel overlords. Now they saw a chance to break free, even if it meant siding with the Spaniards. In May 1521, Cortés began the siege of Tenochtitlan. First, he cut off the causeways. Then, with brigantine ships assembled on the lake, he blockaded the waters, severing the city from its food and supplies. Day by day, street by street, the Spaniards and their allies fought their way through the capital. The Aztecs resisted with all they had. Even starving and sick, they fought from rooftops, from canals, from the last sacred spaces of their city. They turned temples into strongholds, maize fields into battlefields. But they could not stop the siege. What the sword had begun, the disease had deepened, and hunger would soon finish. By the time the final assault began, Tenochtitlan was no longer the shining city Cortés had first seen. It was a shadow of itself, broken, burning, yet still unwilling to kneel. Not yet. By August of 1521, the city of Tenochtitlan, once a symbol of order, beauty, and divine purpose, had become a graveyard. The canals that once shimmered with sunlight and trade now ran dark with filth and blood. The causeways were choked with bodies. The floating gardens wilted in silence. Smoke rose from temples that had stood for centuries. For 93 days, the Aztecs had held on, hungry, sick, and surrounded. They had fought with sharpened stones, obsidian blades, and sheer will. Their new emperor, Cuauhtémoc, refused to surrender. Even as his people collapsed from exhaustion, he believed in the sacredness of their cause. But the siege was relentless. Spanish cannons tore through stone walls. Their brigantines ruled the lake. Thousands of native allies overwhelmed the defenders. No help came. No miracle arrived. And finally, on August 13, 1521, the fighting stopped. Cuauhtémoc was captured as he attempted to flee by canoe. Brought before Cortés, he is said to have spoken with dignity. "I have done what was my duty in defense of my people. Now I am your prisoner. Take this dagger and kill me." Cortés spared him for the moment, perhaps seeing value in a living symbol of conquest. But the city was lost. Tenochtitlan, once home to over 200,000 people, was reduced to ashes and ruins. The temples were looted. Sacred texts were destroyed. Survivors were enslaved or left to starve among the rubble. The lake, which had once nourished the city, was filled in and buried under the weight of empire. In its place, Cortés would begin to build Mexico City, a new capital for a new colony laid atop the bones of a fallen civilization. But something had also died in the Spaniards. The wonder they once felt when they first entered the city had been replaced by silence, by scorched stone, by the echoes of what once was. The conquest was over, the victory was complete. And yet the cost, to both conqueror and conquered, was immeasurable. The Aztec Empire, with its gods, its beauty, and its contradictions, was no more, but the story, the memory, the weight of it would live on forever. The Aztec Empire is gone. Its temples lie in fragments, buried beneath asphalt and stone. Its kings are silent, its gods no longer worshipped in firelit temples, and its capital, Tenochtitlan, exists only in the memories of chroniclers and the ruins beneath Mexico City. But even in destruction, something remains. You can hear it in the language. Nahuatl, the tongue of the Aztecs, is still spoken by over 1 million people in Mexico today. Its words live on in the everyday. Chocolate, tomato, avocado, coyote. Sounds that once filled the halls of emperors now pass between farmers and children. You can feel it in the art. Intricate patterns, serpent motifs, eagle feathers carved in stone. Echoes of a culture that saw the divine in every mountain, river, and sky. In museums and markets, the aesthetics of Aztec life still inspire. You can taste it in the food. Maize, chili, cacao, sacred staples that fed a civilization now feed the world, and you can see it in the people. Descendants of the Mexica and other Nahua peoples walk the streets of Mexico today, their ancestry braided quietly into their faces, their crafts, their stories. Though the Spaniards built over the ruins, they could not erase the soul of what came before. And while the conquest was swift, brutal, and devastating, it wasn't the end of the Aztec spirit. It was a transformation, forced, painful, but never total. Indigenous traditions adapted, survived in secret, fused with the new to create something entirely unique. The fall of the Aztec Empire is often remembered as a cautionary tale, a clash of worlds, a collision of ambition and misunderstanding. But it is also a lesson in resilience. For all the gold taken and the blood spilled, the Spaniards could not take the memory. They could not silence the volcanoes that once watched over Tenochtitlan. They could not erase the stories, told in murals, in chants, in whispered prayers to the old gods. And in the shadows of Mexico's cathedrals and its government buildings, stones from ancient temples still lie, quiet and watching. Time may have buried the empire, but its heart still beats beneath the soil, within the people, and in the stories we continue to tell. For the soldiers of World War I, the trenches were more than a battlefield. They were a way of life, carved deep into the European landscape, stretching from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border. They formed a zigzagging network of mud, blood, and wire. When men first entered the trenches, many thought it would be temporary. They imagined a quick war, a few weeks, maybe months. They didn't expect years of mud-soaked silence, of frozen fingers gripping rifles, of sleeping inches from death. The trenches were narrow, often just wide enough for 2 men to pass. The floor, churned by boots and rain, became a thick soup of water and rot. Boards were laid down to form duckboards, but they floated on top of the filth rather than fixing it. In some places, soldiers stood ankle-deep in water for days, their skin softening, blistering, and turning grey. This was the birthplace of trench foot, a condition that turned feet numb, swollen, and eventually black. In severe cases, toes had to be amputated. Above them, barbed wire snarled in every direction. An endless tangle meant to stop the enemy and trap the careless. Just beyond it lay no man's land, the dead zone between trenches, filled with shell holes, shattered trees, and corpses that no one dared recover. Even when the guns were silent, death was always near. Snipers waited for any movement above the parapet. Artillery strikes came without warning, turning calm into chaos in seconds. The air reeked of decay, unwashed bodies, and wet earth. Rats thrived, growing fat on fallen soldiers. Lice burrowed into clothing and skin, causing constant itching and spreading disease. Sleep came in short bursts. Food arrived cold. Mail was a treasure. And yet, the men adapted. They dug deeper, built shelters from sandbags and scrap metal, shared cigarettes, and carved makeshift furniture from broken crates. They made jokes, wrote letters, and waited, day after day. In the trenches, survival wasn't just physical, it was mental. It meant holding on to identity, humor, and hope, even as the world crumbled around them. It wasn't the front lines that broke most men. It was the slow, endless grind of life behind the mud and the wire. In the grim silence of the trenches, where mud soaked through boots and fear was constant, there was one thing that brought warmth more powerful than fire. Letters. Mail call was sacred. A scrap of paper from home, from a wife, a sweetheart, a mother, a child, meant more than rations or rest. It was proof that life beyond the wire still existed, that someone remembered you not as a soldier, but as a person. Soldiers wrote by candlelight, hunched in dugouts, surrounded by the scent of damp earth and tobacco. Their words were simple, sometimes poetic, often fragile. They described the weather, the food, the small moments of calm. Many left out the horrors. They didn't want to worry those back home. They wanted to protect them, even as shells exploded overhead. Some wrote daily, others less often. They addressed their wives as "my dearest," their mothers as "dear mom," their children with aching tenderness. I hope you are well. I am still in one piece. I miss your voice. Tell the baby I love her. Some even enclosed pressed flowers, drawn sketches, or small trinkets found on the battlefield. Receiving a letter was a ritual. Soldiers would read it once, then again, then again. They folded it carefully, tucked it into a pocket near their chest, or hid it in a tin to protect it from the rain. They read them aloud to each other, passed them around, shared in each other's happiness or heartbreak. But sometimes a letter arrived too late. Mail could take weeks. It might arrive after its intended reader had already fallen in battle. In those moments, comrades would gather, open it slowly, and read the words aloud in the dead man's memory. One last connection to the life he left behind. In a war of machinery and madness, where men became numbers and losses were counted by the thousands, letters reminded everyone of their humanity. They were bridges between worlds, one of peace, the other of war. They carried love, fear, longing, and hope, and in a place where nothing felt certain. A letter, however small, could save a man's spirit. It was Christmas Eve, 1914, the first winter of a war that many had believed would be over by now. The trenches were cold and soaked with frost. Soldiers huddled beneath blankets, thinking of home, of warmth, of peace. Then across no man's land came an unfamiliar sound. Singing. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht. Silent night, holy night. German voices rose softly into the night air. British troops listened, confused, then answered with their own carols. One by one, heads began to rise above the parapets. What followed would become one of the most human moments in a deeply inhuman war. Without orders, without planning, soldiers began to climb out of the trenches. They met in the middle of no man's land, that dead space filled with barbed wire and broken bodies, and shook hands. Some exchanged buttons, tobacco, and chocolate. Others offered sausages or plum pudding. And then someone produced a ball. A game of football began, boots kicking through mud and snow, rifles left behind. The match had no score, no rules, no sides, just men laughing together under a cold winter sky. They showed each other photographs of wives and children. They buried their dead. They lit candles and shared songs in languages they didn't speak. For a brief moment, there was no war, no enemy, only men, cold, tired, and aching for peace. But it could not last. The generals were furious when they learned of it. Commanders issued strict orders forbidding any further contact. Artillery fire soon returned. Snipers resumed their posts. The soldiers went back to their trenches, and to the business of killing those they had just embraced. The truce was never repeated on such a scale again, but for those who were there, it remained a memory that refused to fade. A sliver of light in a war made of darkness. A reminder that beneath every uniform was a beating heart, capable of compassion even on the most violent ground. It did not end the war. But it proved, even for a single day, that humanity could still rise above it. And sometimes, peace didn't need to be signed by generals. It just needed to be chosen by men with frozen hands and open hearts. The noise of war is unforgettable. The scream of shells, the hammering of machine guns, the sudden final crack of a sniper's bullet. But what many soldiers remembered most was the silence. Between the battles, there were long, stretching hours where nothing seemed to happen. No advances, no charges, just the damp, heavy air of waiting. And it was in that stillness that the true war took its toll. In those quiet hours, men sat with their thoughts. Some wrote letters. Some smoked until their fingers shook. Others simply stared at the wooden walls of the trench, eyes empty, waiting for the next order, the next blast, the next name to vanish. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was thick, unnatural. The kind of quiet that made even the birds cautious. Any sound, a snapped twig, a distant cough, could be a signal, a prelude, a mistake. At night, the tension only grew. Flares rose like ghosts above no man's land, casting long shadows across the wire. Men whispered, afraid even of their own voices. Every hour brought the question, is this the night they come? Sometimes the silence broke without warning. An artillery shell dropped at random. A scout discovered in the wire. A raid, sudden and savage, ending as quickly as it began. Then the quiet would return, somehow worse than before. During these pauses, soldiers repaired trenches, buried the dead, and reinforced the walls. They brewed tea in dirty tins, played cards with worn decks, and told stories, some real, some imagined, just to keep their minds anchored to something beyond the mud. The silence offered no rest, only reflection. And in reflection, fear found its roots. Men began to count their breaths, their days, their chances. They listened to their heartbeat like it was the last thing they owned. And yet, they stayed, not out of glory or hope, but because the trench was the only world left. Between the barrages, time slowed. The war paused, but it never stopped. And in those hollow hours between thunder and death, the human spirit learned to wait, not with peace, but with quiet endurance. Because in trench life, survival was not just in the fighting, it was in the waiting. The first gas attack came like a strange green mist. It drifted silently across the battlefield, moving low to the ground, hugging the earth as though it were alive. There was no warning, no explosion, no roar, just a slow, unnatural fog. And then the coughing began. It was April 1915, near Ypres, Belgium, when the Germans unleashed chlorine gas against Allied lines. Soldiers stood stunned, watching the cloud approach, not yet understanding what it was. And by the time they realized, it was too late. The gas burned the eyes and throat, turned lungs to liquid, and made the strongest men drop to their knees, gasping like drowning fish. Panic spread faster than the gas itself. Some men urinated on rags and pressed them to their faces, desperate for anything that might help. Later came phosgene, more deadly, less detectable, and then mustard gas, which blistered the skin, blinded the eyes, and lingered in the soil for weeks. It didn't just kill, it maimed, it scarred, it left men alive, but changed. Gas masks were soon issued, strange, rubber-faced contraptions with bug-like goggles and long snouts. They were effective, but not always in time. Putting them on in panic, in the dark, in the rain, it wasn't always possible, and the fear remained. Even when there was no gas, soldiers imagined it. A whiff of smoke, a shift in the wind, a strange scent, and the mask would be on in seconds. Many described the gas as a ghost, invisible, unpredictable, always present. It crept into dreams, into the deepest parts of the mind. Gas changed the nature of the war. It made the air itself the enemy. It turned the trenches from a battlefield into a slow, suffocating tomb. And worst of all, it made death impersonal, no duel, no charge, no heroism, just a breath, and then agony. Even those who survived were left coughing for years, their lungs ruined, their voices never the same. Of all the horrors of trench life, gas left one of the deepest marks, because it reminded soldiers that in this war there was nowhere left to hide, not even in the air they breathed. In the middle of the mud, the barbed wire, and the constant threat of death, there was one thing that made trench life bearable: each other. Comradeship was more than friendship. It was survival. When everything else was stripped away, the uniforms, the orders, the medals, what remained were men, cold and frightened, clinging to the familiar sound of a voice nearby. They came from all walks of life: farmers, factory workers, teachers, sons. Many had never left their hometowns before the war, but in the trenches, distinctions blurred. One man's dry socks became another man's lifeline. One soldier's humor kept the whole group sane. They shared everything: cigarettes, blankets, rations, lice. They passed down trench law: which dugout stayed driest, which officer to trust, how to brew the best cup of tea over a candle flame. And when the shelling stopped, even for just a moment, they would gather, mugs in hand, steam rising from chipped enamel cups filled with weak, gritty coffee or tea made from boiled rainwater. These moments were sacred. Men told jokes, some crude, some clever, some so old they'd been passed between units like heirlooms. They sang songs that reminded them of home. Sometimes they played cards. Other times, they simply sat, grateful for the silence, for the warmth, for the company. They spoke of things beyond the war, of sweethearts and sisters, of favorite meals and summer days long gone. Some made plans for after the war, where they would go, what they would build, who they would marry. Others didn't speak at all, but listened, letting the words of their mates carry them somewhere safer, even for just a few minutes. And when one of them fell, it wasn't an anonymous name on a casualty list. It was someone they'd laughed with, argued with, shared a blanket with. A missing seat in the circle. A silence louder than the guns. In a war filled with so much loss, it was the small human connections that held men together. It wasn't glory or nationalism or orders that kept them in the trenches. It was the bond between brothers, forged not in fire but in frost, laughter, and the simple comfort of a hot drink passed hand to hand. Night in the trenches was a different kind of terror. The darkness didn't bring rest, it brought uncertainty. It blurred the line between what was real and what was imagined. Shadows stretched across no man's land. The sky, once filled with birds and clouds, now held only silence and the occasional flare, burning bright and unnatural in the cold air. Every sound mattered. A distant footstep, a shovel scraping dirt, the sharp click of a rifle bolt. Each noise could mean an enemy patrol, a raid, or worse, an ambush. Men took turns on sentry duty, standing motionless, eyes straining into the dark, hearts pounding against their ribs. A mistake could mean a bayonet in the chest, or a whispered death in the mud. Some nights snipers waited, their scopes trained on even the faintest flicker of movement. A single spark from a cigarette could be a soldier's last mistake. Sleep, when it came, was brief and uneasy. Soldiers dozed with boots on, rifles close, often in shallow dugouts, barely wide enough to roll over in. Dreams, when they came, were filled with thunder and smoke. Many learned not to dream at all. The cold crept into bones. Blankets were damp. Bodies pressed together for warmth. And still the fear remained. But not every night brought death. Some were eerily quiet. Too quiet. And that quiet could be just as deadly. It was during these calm stretches that the mind played tricks. Was that a figure moving beyond the wire? Did you hear footsteps? Or was that just the wind? Whispers passed through the trenches like secrets. Orders were given in silence. Patrols sent out in groups of 3 or 4, slipping into no man's land like ghosts, to gather intelligence, lay wire, or sometimes just to remind the enemy they were not alone. Letters were written under flickering candles. Some were love notes, others were goodbyes, not always labeled as such, but written with the quiet knowledge that they might be the last. The night asked questions the day was too busy to consider. Will I survive? Will anyone remember me? And yet, when the sun finally rose, casting weak light over the wreckage of wire and earth, the men were still there, tired, cold, but alive. In the trenches, every sunrise was a victory. Not every wound in the trenches came from bullets or shrapnel. Some were quieter, invisible, but just as deep. Life in the trenches wore men down, not just in body, but in spirit. Each day chipped away at something. Strength, clarity, hope. And for many, the greatest cost of war wasn't death. It was surviving it. Trench foot, caused by standing for days in cold, wet boots, turned skin pale and soft, then black, then dead. Some men lost toes, others lost feet. Lice burrowed into uniforms, causing constant itching and spreading disease. Rats gnawed on food, equipment, even the fallen. But it was the unseen injuries that lasted longest. Shell shock, what we now know as PTSD, left men broken in ways the military didn't understand, or worse, didn't acknowledge. Some returned home unable to speak. Others flinched at loud sounds for the rest of their lives. Many had nightmares that never left them. At the time, some commanders called it cowardice, a failure of character, but the truth was far more tragic. These men weren't weak. They were overwhelmed, minds shaken by the constant stress, the relentless noise, the horror they had witnessed. And then there were the dead who couldn't be reached. Bodies lay out in no man's land, too dangerous to recover, too sacred to forget. They were reminders, markers, silent witnesses to the cost of every advance and every retreat. The emotional toll was immense. Some soldiers carried guilt for surviving when their closest friends had not. Others felt numb, their emotions buried beneath layers of mud and grief. Even rest wasn't easy. Soldiers on leave struggled to adjust to quiet towns and warm homes. They couldn't speak of what they'd seen. They didn't know how, and those who hadn't been to the front couldn't understand. War changed them, not just how they looked or how they walked, but how they felt, how they loved, how they lived. The guns may have fallen silent in moments, but the damage continued, deep and wide. The trenches didn't just consume bodies, they consumed memories, voices, joy, and the echoes of that loss would carry far beyond the battlefield for years to come. The guns finally fell silent on November 11th, 1918. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the war to end all wars officially came to a halt. But silence did not mean peace. Across the Western Front, soldiers emerged from the trenches slowly, cautiously, not quite believing the noise was truly over. Some wept, others stood in stunned quiet. A few stared across no man's land, wondering if the men who had once fired upon them now felt the same strange emptiness. The war was over, but the trenches remained. They didn't vanish. They sat in the mud, abandoned, slowly sinking back into the earth that had been torn apart for 4 long years. Boots, helmets, rusted rifles, and letters never sent were left behind. Small pieces of lives that had once filled those narrow walls. And the soldiers? They returned home, but they didn't come back the same. Many struggled to find their place in a world that had moved on without them. The familiar streets of their towns felt foreign. The laughter of children sounded distant. Some found comfort in silence. Others were haunted by it. The war had reshaped them, their posture, their sleep, their sense of safety. Some limped from old wounds. Others carried scars no one could see. They told few stories, or none at all. The ones who did speak often spoke not of battles, but of moments, a cup of tea shared in the cold, a letter that arrived just in time, a friend who didn't wake up. The trenches became part of history, studied, mapped, photographed. But to those who had lived inside them, they were something else, a second home, a prison, a grave, a place where youth had been left behind and something heavier had taken its place. And yet, from that darkness came resilience. Memorials rose, poppies bloomed, new generations were born because others had endured. and in quiet corners of fields once soaked in blood, birds sing again. Grass grows. Wind whispers through the trees. The trenches have faded from the land, but not from memory, because in that silence something sacred remains, the voices of those who endured the unendurable, and proved, even in the mud and madness, that humanity could survive.